Chapter 9. James the Second's Escapes. We have spoken of the old houses associated with Charles the Second's escapes. Let us see what history has to record of his unpopular brother James. The Stuarts seem to have been doomed at one time or another to evade their enemies by secret flight, and in some measure this may account for the romance always surrounding that ill-fated line of kings and queens. James the Fifth of Scotland was wont to amuse himself by donning a disguise, but his successors appear to have been doomed by fate to follow his example, not for recreation, but to preserve their lives. Mary, Queen of Scots, upon one occasion had to impersonate a laundress. Her grandson and great-grandson both were forced to masquerade as servants, and her great-great-grandson, Prince James Frederick Edward, passed through France disguised as an abbé. The escapades of his son, the bonny prince, will require our attention presently. We will, therefore, for the moment confine our thoughts to James the Second. With the surrender of Oxford, the young Prince James found himself Fairfax's prisoner. His elder brother Charles had been more fortunate, having left the city shortly before for the western counties, and after effecting his escape to Scilly, he sought refuge in Jersey, whence he removed to the Hague. The Duke of Gloucester and the Princess Elizabeth already had been placed under the custody of the Earl of Northumberland at St. James's Palace, so the Duke of York was sent there also. This was in 1646. Some 9 months elapsed, and James, after 2 ineffectual attempts to regain his liberty, eventually succeeded in the following manner. Though prisoners, the royal children were permitted to amuse themselves within the walls of the palace much as they pleased, and among the juvenile games with which they passed away the time, hide and seek was first favourite. James, doubtless with an eye to the future, soon acquired a reputation as an expert hider, and his brother and sister and the playmates with whom they associated would frequently search the odd nooks and corners of the old mansion in vain for an hour at a stretch. It was, therefore, no extraordinary occurrence on the night of April the 20th, 1647, that the prince, after a prolonged search, was missing. The youngsters, more than usually perplexed, presently persuaded the adults of the prison establishment to join in the game, which, when their suspicions were aroused, they did in real earnest, but all in vain, and at length a messenger was dispatched to Whitehall with the intelligence that James, Duke of York, had effected his escape. Everything was in a turmoil. Orders were hurriedly dispatched for all seaport towns to be on the alert, and every exit out of London was strictly watched. Meanwhile, it is scarcely necessary to add, the young fugitive was well clear of the city, speeding on his way to the Continent. The plot had been skilfully planned. A key, or rather a duplicate key, had given admittance through the gardens into St. James's Park, where the royalist, though outwardly professed parliamentarian, Colonel Bampfylde, was in readiness with a periwig and cloak to effect a speedy disguise. When at length the fugitive made his appearance, minus his shoes and coat, he was hurried into a coach and conveyed to the Strand by Salisbury House, where the two alighted, and passing down Ivy Lane reached the river, and after James's disguise had been perfected, boat was taken to Lyons Quay in Lower Thames Street, where a barge lay in readiness to carry them downstream. So far all went well, but on the way to Gravesend the master of the vessel, doubtless with a view to increasing his reward, raised some objections. The fugitive was now in female attire, and the objection was that nothing had been said about a woman coming aboard. But he was at length pacified. Indeed, ere long guessed the truth, for the prince's lack of female decorum, as in the case of his grandson, the bonny prince, nearly a century afterwards, made him guess how matters really stood. Beyond Gravesend the fugitives got aboard a Dutch vessel, and were carried safely to Middleburg. We will now shift the scene to Whitehall, in the year 1688, when, after a brief reign of 3 years, betrayed and deserted on all sides, the unhappy Stuart king was contemplating his second flight out of England. The weathercock that had been set up on the banqueting hall to show when the wind blew Protestant had duly recorded the dreaded approach of Dutch William, who now was steadily advancing towards the capital. On Tuesday, December the 10th, soon after midnight, James left the palace by way of Chiffinch's secret stairs of notorious fame, and, disguised as the servant of Sir Edward Hales, with Ralph Sheldon, Labadie, a page, and Dick Smith, a groom, attending him, crossed the river to Lambeth, dropping the Great Seal in the water on the way, and took horse, avoiding the main roads, towards Farnborough and thence to Chislehurst. Leaving Maidstone to the south-west, a brief halt was made at Pennenden Heath for refreshment. The old inn, the Woolpack, where the party stopped for their hurried repast, remains, at least in name, for the building itself has of late years been replaced by a modern structure. Crossing the Dover road, the party now directed their course towards Milton Creek, to the north-east of Sittingbourne, where a small fishing craft lay in readiness, which had been chartered by Sir Edward Hales, whose seat at Tunstall was close by. Footnote: Tunstall, the principal seat of the Hales, near Canterbury, is now occupied as a Jesuit college. The old manor house of Tunstall, Grove End Farm, presents both externally and internally many features of interest. The family was last represented by a maid lady who died a few years since. End of footnote. One or two old buildings in the desolate marsh district of Elmley claim the distinction of having received a visit of the deposed monarch prior to the mishaps which were shortly to follow. King's Hill Farm, once a house of some importance, preserves this tradition, as does also an ancient cottage in the last stage of decay, known as Rat's Castle. At Elmley Ferry, which crosses the river Swale, the king got aboard, but scarcely had the moorings been cast than further progress was arrested by a party of over-zealous fishermen on the look-out for fugitive Jesuit priests. The story of the rough handling to which the poor king was subjected is a somewhat hackneyed school-book anecdote, but some interesting details have been handed down by one Captain Marsh, by James's natural son, the Duke of Berwick, and by the Earl of Aylesbury. From these accounts we gather that in the disturbance that ensued a blow was aimed at the king, but that a Canterbury innkeeper named Platt threw himself in the way and received the blow himself. It is recorded to James II's credit that when he was recognised and his stolen money and jewels offered back to him, he declined the former, desiring that his health might be drunk by the mob. Among the valuables were the king's watch, his coronation ring, and medals commemorating the births of his son, the Chevalier St. George, and of his brother Charles II. The king was taken ashore at a spot called the Stool, close to the little village of Orr, to the north-west of Faversham, to which town he was conveyed by coach, attended by a score of Kentish gentlemen on horseback. The royal prisoner was first carried to the Queen's Arms Inn, which still exists under the name of the Ship Hotel. From here he was taken to the mayor's house in Court Street, an old building recently pulled down to make way for a new brewery, and placed under a strict guard, and from the window of his prison the unfortunate king had to listen to the proclamation of the Prince of Orange, read by order of the mayor, who subsequently was rewarded for the zeal he displayed upon the occasion. The hardships of the last 24 hours had told severely upon James. He was sick and feeble, and weakened by profuse bleeding of the nose, to which he, like his brother Charles, was subject when unduly excited. Sir Edward Hales, in the meantime, was lodged in the old court hall, since partially rebuilt, whence he was removed to Maidstone gaol and to the Tower. Bishop Burnet was at Windsor with the Prince of Orange when two gentlemen arrived there from Faversham with the news of the king's capture. "They told me," he says, "of the accident at Faversham, and desired to know the Prince's pleasure upon it. I was affected with this dismal reverse of the fortunes of a great prince, more than I think fit to express. I went immediately to Bentinck, and wakened him, and got him to go in to the Prince, and let him know what had happened, that some order might be presently given for the security of the king's person, and for taking him out of the hands of a rude multitude, who said they would obey no orders but such as came from the prince. Upon receiving the news, William at once directed that his father-in-law should have his liberty, and that assistance should be sent down to him immediately. But by this time the story had reached the metropolis, and a hurried meeting of the council directed the Earl of Feversham to go to the rescue with a company of Life Guards. The faithful Earl of Aylesbury also hastened to the king's assistance. In 5 hours he accomplished the journey from London to Faversham. So rapidly had the reports been circulated of supposed ravages of the Irish Papists that when the Earl reached Rochester the entire town was in a state of panic, and the alarmed inhabitants were busily engaged in demolishing the bridge to prevent the dreaded incursion. But to return to James at Faversham. The mariners who had handled him so roughly now took his part, in addition to his property, and insisted upon sleeping in the adjoining room to that in which he was incarcerated, to protect him from further harm. Early on Saturday morning the Earl of Feversham made his appearance, and after some little hesitation on the king's side, he was at length persuaded to return to London. So he set out on horseback, breaking the journey at Rochester, where he slept on the Saturday night at Sir Richard Head's house. On the Sunday he rode on to Dartford, where he took coach to Southwark and Whitehall. A temporary reaction had now set in, and the cordial reception which greeted his appearance revived his hopes and spirits. This reaction, however, was but short-lived, for no sooner had the poor king retired to the privacy of his bedchamber at Whitehall Palace than an imperious message from his son-in-law ordered him to remove without delay to Ham House, Petersham. James objected strongly to this. The place, he said, was damp and unfurnished, which, by the way, was not the case, if we may judge from Evelyn, who visited the mansion not long before, when it was furnished like a great prince's. Indeed, the same furniture remains intact to this day. And a message was sent back that if he must quit Whitehall he would prefer to retire to Rochester, which was readily accorded him. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. James II.'s escapes continued. Ham House and Abdication House. Tradition, regardless of fact, associates the grand old seat of the Lauderdales and Dysarts with King James's escape from England. A certain secret staircase is still pointed out by which the dethroned monarch is said to have made his exit, and visitors to the Stuart exhibition a few years ago will remember a sword which, with the king's hat and cloak, is said to have been left behind when he quitted the mansion. Now there existed, not many miles away, also close to the river Thames, another Ham House, which was closely associated with James II, and it seems therefore possible, in fact probable, that the past associations of the one house have attached themselves to the other. In Ham House, Weybridge, lived for some years the king's discarded mistress, Catherine Sedley, Countess of Dorchester. At the actual time of James's abdication this lady was in France, but in the earlier part of his reign the king was a frequent visitor here. In Charles II's time the house belonged to Jane Bickerton, the mistress and afterwards wife of the 6th Duke of Norfolk. Evelyn dined there soon after this marriage had been solemnized. "The Duke," he says, "leading me about the house, made no scruple of showing me all the hiding places for the popish priests, and where they said mass, for he was no bigoted papist." At the Duke's death the palace was sold to the Countess of Dorchester, whose descendants pulled it down some 50 years ago. The oak-panelled rooms were richly parquetted with cedar and cypress. One of them, until the last, retained the name of the King's Bedroom. It had a private communication with a little Roman Catholic chapel in the building. The attics, as at Compton Winyates, were called the Barracks, tradition associating them with the King's Guards, who are said to have been lodged there. Upon the walls hung portraits of the Duchesses of Leeds and Dorset, of Nell Gwynn, and the Countess herself, and of Earl Portmore, who married her daughter. Here also, formerly, was Holbein's famous picture, Bluff King Hal and the Dukes of Suffolk and Norfolk dancing a minuet with Anne Boleyn and the Dowager Queens of France and Scotland. Evelyn saw the painting in August 1678, and records the sprightly motion and amorous countenances of the ladies. This picture is now, or was recently, in the possession of Major General Sotheby. A few years after James's abdication, the Earl of Aylesbury rented the house from the Countess, who lived meanwhile in a small house adjacent, and was in the habit of coming into the gardens of the palace by a key of admittance she kept for that purpose. Upon one of these occasions the Earl and she had a disagreement about the lease, and so forcible were the lady's coarse expressions, for she never could restrain the license of her tongue, that she had to be ejected from the premises. Whereupon, said Aylesbury, she bade me go to my King James, with the assurance that she would make King William spit on me. But to follow James II.'s ill fortunes to Rochester, where he was conveyed on the Tuesday at noon by royal barge, with an escort of Dutch soldiers, with Lords Arran, Dumbarton, etc. in attendance. A sad sight, says Evelyn, who witnessed the departure. The king recognized among those set to guard him an old lieutenant of the horse who had fought under him when Duke of York at the Battle of Dunkirk. Colonel Wick, in command of the king's escort, was a nephew of the court painter Sir Peter Lely, who had owed his success to the patronage of Charles II. and his brother. The part the colonel had to act was a painful one, and he begged the king's pardon. The royal prisoner was lodged for the night at Gravesend, at the house of a lawyer, and next morning the journey was continued to Rochester. The royalist Sir Richard Head again had the honour of acting as the king's host, and his guest was allowed to go in and out of the house as he pleased, for diplomatic William of Orange had arranged that no opportunity should be lost for James to make use of a passport which the Duke of Berwick had obtained for a certain gentleman and 2 servants. James's movements, therefore, were hampered in no way, but the king, ever suspicious, planned his escape from Rochester with the greatest caution and secrecy, and many of his most attached and loyal adherents were kept in ignorance of his final departure. James's little court consisted of the Earls of Arran, Lichfield, Middleton, Dumbarton, and Aylesbury, the Duke of Berwick, Sir Stephen Fox, Major General Sackville, Mr. Graham, Fenton, and a few others. On the evening of the king's flight the company dispersed as was customary, when Aylesbury intimated by removing his Majesty's stockings that the king was about to seek his couch. The Earl of Dumbarton retired with James to his apartment, who, when the house was quiet for the night, got up, dressed, and, by way of the back stairs, according to the Stuart papers, passed through the garden where Macdonald stayed for him, with the Duke of Berwick and Mr. Biddulph to show him the way to Trevanion's boat. About 12 at night they rowed down to the smack, which was waiting without the fort at Sheerness. It blew so hard right ahead, and ebb tide being done before they got to the salt pans, that it was nearly 6 before they got to the smack. Captain Trevanion not being able to trust the officers of his ship, they got on board the Eagle fireship, commanded by Captain Welford, on which, the wind and tide being against them, they stayed till daybreak, when the king went on board the smack. On Christmas Day James landed at Ambleteuse. Thus the old town of Rochester witnessed the departure of the last male representative of the Stuart line who wore a crown. 28 years before, every window and gable end had been gaily bedecked with many-coloured ribbons, banners, and flowers to welcome in the restored monarch. The picturesque old red brick Restoration House still stands to carry us back to the eventful night when His Sacred Majesty slept within its walls upon his way from Dover to London, a striking contrast to Abdication House, the gloomy abode of Sir Richard Head, of more melancholy associations. Much altered and modernised, this old mansion also remains. It is in the High Street, and is now, or was recently, occupied as a draper's shop. Here may be seen the presence chamber, where the dethroned king heard mass, and the royal bedchamber, where, after his secret departure, a letter was found on the table addressed to Lord Middleton, for both he and Lord Aylesbury were kept in ignorance of James II.'s final movements. The old garden may be seen, with the steps leading down to the river, much as it was a couple of centuries ago, though the river now no longer flows in near proximity, owing to the drainage of the marshes and the subsequent improvements of later days. The hidden passage in the staircase wall may also be seen, and the trap-door leading to it from the attics above. Tradition says the king made use of these, and if he did so, the probability is that it was done more to avoid his host's over-zealous neighbours than from fear of arrest through the vigilance of the spies of his son-in-law. Footnote: it may be of interest to state that the illustrations given of the house were originally exhibited at the Stuart Exhibition by Sir Robert G. Head, the living representative of the old royalist family. End footnote. Exactly 3 months after James left England he made his reappearance at Kinsale, and entered Dublin in triumphal state. The siege of Londonderry and the decisive battle of the Boyne followed, and for a third and last time James II. Was a fugitive from his realms. The melancholy story is graphically told in Mr. A. C. Gow's dramatic picture, an engraving of which, I understand, has recently been published. How the unfortunate king rode from Dublin to Duncannon Fort, leaving his faithful followers and ill fortunes behind him, got aboard the French vessel anchored there for his safety, and returned once more to the protection of the Grand Monarque at the Palace of Saint-Germain, is an oft-told story of Stuart ingratitude. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. Mysterious Rooms, Deadly Pits, etc. At the Restoration House, previously mentioned, there is a secret passage in the wall of an upper room, but though the Merry Monarch is, according to popular tradition, credited with a monopoly of hiding-places all over England, it is more than doubtful whether he had recourse to these exploits, in which he was so successful in 1651, upon such a joyful occasion, except, indeed, through sheer force of habit. Even Cromwell's name is connected with hiding-places, but it is difficult to conjecture upon what occasions his Excellency found it convenient to secrete himself, unless it was in his later days, when he went about in fear of assassination. Hale House, Islington, pulled down in 1853, had a concealed recess behind the wainscot over the mantelpiece, formed by the curve of the chimney. In this, tradition says, the Lord Protector was hidden. Nor is this the solitary instance, for a dark hole in one of the gable ends of Cromwell House, Mortlake, taken down in 1860, locally known as Old Noll's Hole, is said to have afforded him temporary accommodation when his life was in danger. The residence of his son-in-law Ireton, Cromwell House, at Highgate, contained a large secret chamber at the back of a cupboard in one of the upper rooms, and extended back 12 or 14 feet, but the cupboard has now been removed, and the space at the back converted into a passage. The ancient manor house of Armscott, in an old-world corner of Worcestershire, contains in one of its gables a hiding-place entered through a narrow opening in the plaster wall, not unlike that at Ufton Court, and capable of holding many people. From the fact that George Fox was arrested in this house on October 17th, 1673, when he was being persecuted by the county magistrates, the story has come down to the yokels of the neighbourhood that old Guy Fawkes, the first Quaker, was hidden here. In his journal Fox mentions his arrest at Armscote after a "very large and precious meeting" in the barn close by, but we have no allusion to the hiding-place, for he appears to have been sitting in the parlour when Henry Parker, the justice, arrived. Indeed, George Fox was not the sort of man to have recourse to concealments and owe his escape to a priest's hole. The suggestion of a sudden reverse in religious persecution driving a Quaker to such an extremity calls to mind an old farmstead where a political change from monarchy to commonwealth forced Puritan and Cavalier consecutively to seek refuge in the secret chamber. This narrow hiding-place beside the spacious fireplace is pointed out in an ancient house in the parish of Hinchford in eastern Essex. Even the notorious Judge Jeffreys had in his house facilities for concealment and escape. His old residence in Delahaye Street, Westminster, demolished a few years ago, had its secret panel in the wainscoting, but in what way the cruel Lord Chancellor made use of it does not transpire. Possibly it may have been utilised at the time of James II's flight from Whitehall. A remarkable discovery was made early in the last century at the Elizabethan manor house of Bourton-on-the-Water, Gloucestershire, only a portion of which remains, incorporated in a modern structure. Upon removing some of the wallpaper of a passage on the second floor, the entrance to a room hitherto unknown was laid bare. It was a small apartment about 8 feet square, and presented the appearance as if some occupant had just quitted it. A chair and a table within each bore evidence of the last inmate. Over the back of the former hung a priest's black cassock, carelessly flung there a century or more ago, while on the table stood an antique teapot, cup, and silver spoon, the very tea-leaves crumbled to dust with age. On the same story were 2 rooms known as the chapel and the priest's room, the names of which signify the former use of the concealed apartment. Sir Walter Scott records a curious find, similar in many respects to that at Bourton. In the course of some structural alterations to an ancient house near Edinburgh, 3 unknown rooms were brought to light, bearing testimony of their last inmate. One of them had been occupied as a bedroom. The clothing of the bed was disarranged, as if it had been slept in only a few hours previously, and close by was an antique dressing-gown. How interesting it would be to know some particulars of the sudden surprise which evidently drove the owner of the garment from his snug quarters, whether he effected his escape, or whether he was captured. The walls of this buried chamber, if they could speak, had some curious story to relate. Not many years ago the late squire of East Hendred House, Berkshire, discovered the existence of a secret chamber in casually glancing over some ancient papers belonging to the house. The little room, as it was called, from its proximity to the chapel, had no doubt been turned to good account during the penal laws of Elizabeth's reign, as the chamber itself and other parts of the house date from a much earlier period. Long after the palatial Sussex mansion of Cowdray was burned down, the habitable remains, the keeper's lodge in the centre of the park, contained an ingenious hiding-place behind a fireplace in a bedroom, which was reached by a movable panel in a cupboard, communicating with the roof by a slender flight of steps. It was very high, reaching up 2 stories, but extremely narrow, so much so that directly opposite a stone bench, which stood in a recess for a seat, the wall was hollowed out to admit of the knees. When this secret chamber was discovered, it contained an iron chair, a quaint old brass lamp, and some manuscripts of the Montague family. The Cowdray tradition says that the 5th Viscount was concealed in this hiding-place for a considerable period, owing to some dark crime he is supposed to have committed, though he was generally believed to have fled abroad. Secret nocturnal interviews took place between Lord Montague and his wife in My Lady's Walk, an isolated spot in Cowdray Park. The Montagues, now extinct, are said to have been very chary with reference to their Roman Catholic forefathers, and never allowed the secret chamber to be shown. A weird story clings to the ruins of Minster Lovel Manor House, Oxfordshire, the ancient seat of the Lords Lovel. After the Battle of Stoke, Francis, the last Viscount, who had sided with the cause of Simnel against King Henry VII, fled back to his house in disguise, but from the night of his return was never seen or heard of again, and for nearly 2 centuries his disappearance remained a mystery. In the meantime the manor house had been dismantled, and the remains tenanted by a farmer, but a strange discovery was made in the year 1708. A concealed vault was found, and in it, seated before a table, with a prayer book lying open upon it, was the entire skeleton of a man. In the secret chamber were certain barrels and jars, which had contained food sufficient to last perhaps some weeks, but the mansion having been seized by the King, soon after the unfortunate Lord Lovel is supposed to have concealed himself, the probability is that, unable to regain his liberty, the neglect or treachery of a servant or tenant brought about this tragic end. A discovery of this nature was made in 1785 in a hidden vault at the foot of a stone staircase at Brandon Hall, Suffolk. Kingerby Hall, Lincolnshire, has a ghostly tradition of an unfortunate occupant of the hiding hole near a fireplace being intentionally fastened in, so that he was stifled with the heat and smoke. The skeleton was found years afterwards in this horrible death chamber. Bayonne's Manor, in the same county, has some very curious arrangements for the sake of secretion and defence. There is a room in one of the Barbican towers occupying its entire circumference, but so effectually hidden that its existence would never be suspected. In 2 of the towers are curious concealed stairs, and approaching the Bishop's Tower from the outer court or ballium, part of a flight of steps can be raised like a drawbridge to prevent sudden intrusions. A contributor to that excellent little journal The Rambler, unfortunately now extinct, mentions another very strange and weird device for security. "In the state-room of my castle," says the owner of this death-trap, "is the family shield, which on a part being touched revolves, and a flight of steps becomes visible. The 1st, 3rd, 5th, and all odd steps are to be trusted, but to tread on any of the others is to set in motion some concealed machinery which causes the staircase to collapse, disclosing a vault some 70 feet in depth, down which the unwary are precipitated." At Tyttonhanger House, Hertfordshire, and in the old manor house of Newport, Isle of Wight, where the captive King Charles I spent some of his last melancholy days, there are rooms with passages in the walls running completely round them. Similar passages were found some years ago while making alterations to Highclere Castle, Hampshire. The once magnificent Madeley Court, Salop, now, alas, in the last stage of desolation and decay, surrounded by coal-fields and undermined by pits, is honeycombed with places for concealment and escape. A ruinous apartment at the top of the house, known as the chapel, only a few years ago wainscoted to the ceiling and divided by fine old oak screens, contained a secret chamber behind one of the panels. This could be fastened on the inside by a strong bolt. The walls of the mansion are of immense thickness, and the recesses and nooks noticeable everywhere were evidently at one time places of concealment. One long triangular recess extends between 2 ruinous chambers, mere skeletons of past grandeur, and was no doubt for the purpose of reaching the basement from the 1st floor other than by the staircases. In the upper part of the house a dismal pit or well extends to the ground level, where it slants off in an oblique direction below the building, and terminates in a large pool or lake. after the fashion of that already described at Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire. Footnote: this house, Madeley Court, must not be confused with the Upper House connected with Charles II's wanderings. End footnote. Everything points to the former magnificence of this mansion: the elaborate gatehouse, the handsome stone porch, and even the colossal sundial, which last, for quaint design, can hold its own with those of the greatest baronial castles in Scotland. The arms of the Brooke family are to be seen emblazoned on the walls, a member of whom, Sir Basil, was he who christened the hunting lodge of the Giffards Boscobel, from the Italian words bos cobello, on account of its woody situation. It is long since the Brookes migrated from Madeley, now close on 2 centuries. The deadly-looking pits occasionally seen in ancient buildings are dangerous, to say the least of it. They may be likened to the shaft of our modern lift, with the car at the bottom, and nothing above to prevent one taking a step into eternity. A friend at Twickenham sends us a curious account of a recent exploration of what was once the manor house, Aragon Towers. We cannot do better than quote his words, written in answer to a request for particulars. "I did not," he says, "make sufficient examination of the hiding-place in the old manor house of Twickenham to give a detailed description of it, and I have no one here whom I could get to accompany me in exploring it now. It is not a thing to do by one's self, as one might make a false step, and have no one to assist in retrieving it. The entrance is in the top room of the one remaining turret, by means of a movable panel in the wall opposite the window. The panel displaced, you see the top of a thick wall, almost on a line with the floor of the room. The width of the aperture is, I should think, nearly 3 feet, that of the wall top about 1.5 feet. The remaining space between the wall top and the outer wall of the house is what you might perhaps term a chasm. It is a sheer drop to the cellars of the house. I was told by the workmen that by walking the length of the wall top, some 15 feet, I should reach a stairway conducting to the vaults below, and that on reaching the bottom a passage led off in the direction of the river, the tradition being that it actually went beneath the river to Ham House. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. Hiding places in Jacobite dwellings and in Scottish castles and mansions. During the Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745, some of the priests' holes in the old Roman Catholic houses, especially in the north of England and in Scotland, came into requisition not only for storing arms and ammunition, but, after the failure of each enterprise, for concealing adherents of the luckless house of Stuart. In the earlier mansion of Worksop, Nottinghamshire, burnt down in 1761, there was a large concealed chamber provided with a fireplace and a bed, which could only be entered by removing the sheets of lead forming the roofing. Beneath was a trap-door opening to a precipitous flight of narrow steps in the thickness of a wall. This led to a secret chamber that had an inner hiding-place at the back of a sliding panel. A witness in a trial succeeding the '45 declared to having seen a large quantity of arms there in readiness for the insurrection. The last days of the notorious Lord Lovat are associated with some of the old houses in the north. Cawdor Castle, Nairnshire, and Netherwhitton, in Northumberland, claim the honour of hiding this double-faced traitor prior to his arrest. At the former is a small chamber near the roof, and in the latter is a hiding-place measuring 8 feet by 3 and 10 feet high. Nor must be forgotten the tradition of Mistress Beatrice Cope, behind the walls of whose bedroom Lovat, so goes the story, was concealed, and the fugitive, being asthmatical, would have revealed his whereabouts to the soldiers in search of him, had not Mistress Cope herself kept up a persistent and violent fit of coughing to drown the noise. A secret room in the old Tudor house T. Moor, Monmouthshire, is associated with the Jacobite risings. It is at the back of the parlour fireplace, and is entered through a square stone slab at the foot of the staircase. The chamber is provided with a small fireplace, the flue of which is connected with the ordinary chimney, so as to conceal the smoke. The same sort of thing may be seen at Bisham Abbey, Berks. Early in the last century a large hiding-place was found at Danby Hall, Yorkshire. It contained a large quantity of swords and pistols. Upwards of 50 sets of harness of untanned leather of the early part of the 18th century were further discovered, all of them in so good a state of preservation that they were afterwards used as cart-horse gear upon the farm. No less than 9 of the followers of bonny Prince Charlie are said to have been concealed in a secret chamber at Fetternear, Kenmay, Aberdeenshire, an old seat of the Leslies of Balquhane. It was situated in the wall behind a large bookcase with a glazed front, a fixture in the room, the back of which could be made to slide back and give admittance to the recess. Quite by accident an opening was discovered in a corner cupboard at an old house near Darlington. Certain alterations were in progress which necessitated the removal of the shelves, but upon this being attempted they descended in some mysterious manner. The back of the cavity could then be pushed aside, that is to say, when the secret of its mechanism was discovered, and a hiding-place opened out to view. It contained some tawdry ornaments of Highland dress, which at one time, it was conjectured, belonged to an adherent of Prince Charlie. The old mansion of Stonyhurst, Lancashire, contained 8 hiding-places. One of them, exactly like that at Fetternear, was at the back of a bookcase. A secret spring was discovered, which opened a concealed door in the wall. In the space behind, a quantity of James II. guineas, a bed, a mattress, and a flask of rum were found. A former student of this famous Jesuit college, who was instrumental in the discovery of a priest's hole, has provided us with the following particulars. It would be too long to tell you how I first discovered that in the floor of my bedroom, in the recess of the huge Elizabethan bay window, was a trap-door concealed by a thin veneering of oak. Suffice it to say that with a companion I devoted a delightful half-holiday to stripping off the veneering and breaking the lock of the trap-door. Between my floor and the ceiling of the long gallery below was contrived a small room about 5 feet in height, and the size and shape of the bay-window recess. In one corner of this hiding-hole was what seemed a walled-up doorway, and it occurred to my companion and myself that we had heard some vague old tradition that all this part of the house was riddled with secret passages leading from one concealed chamber to another, but we did not seek to explore any farther. In pulling down a portion of the college, a hollow beam was discovered that opened upon concealed hinges, used formerly for secreting articles of value or sacred books and vessels, and during some alterations to the central tower, over the main entrance to the mansion a priest's hole was found, containing several horse pistols ready loaded, and some of them richly ornamented with silver. A view could be obtained from the interior of the hiding-place in the same manner as that which we have described in the old summer-house at Salisbury, a small hall being devised in the design of the Sherborne arms upon the marble shield over the gateway. This was the only provision for air and light. The quaint discovery of rum at Stonyhurst suggests the story of a hiding-place in an old house at Bishop's Middleham, near Durham, mentioned by Southey in his commonplace book. The house was occupied for years by a supposed total abstainer, but a priest's hole in his bedroom, discovered after his death, full of strong liquor, revealed the fact that by utilizing the receptacle as a cellar he had been able to imbibe secretly to his heart's content. A large quantity of Georgian gold coins were found some years ago in a small hiding-place under the oaken sill of a bedroom window at Gawthorpe Hall, Lancashire, placed there, it is supposed, for the use of Prince Charles's army in passing through the country in 1745. The Laird of Bellerig, an old mansion in the parish of Aboyne, Aberdeenshire, was concealed after the '45 in his own house, while his wife, like the hostess of Chastleton, hospitably entertained the soldiers who were in search of him. The The secret chamber where he was concealed was found some years ago in making some alterations to the roof. In it were a quantity of Jacobite papers and a curious old armchair. The original entry was through a panel at the back of a box bed in the wainscot of a small isolated bedroom at the top of the house. The room itself could only be reached by a secret staircase from a corridor below. The hiding place was therefore doubly secure, and was a stronghold in case of greatest emergency. The Innes of Drumgursk and Bellecraig were always staunch Roman Catholics and Jacobites. Their representatives lived in the old house until 1850. In another old Aberdeenshire mansion, Dalpercy House, a hiding hole or recess may be seen in one of the upper chambers, where was arrested a Gordon, one of the last victims executed after the '45. The ancient castles of Fyvie, Elphinstone, and Kemnay House have their secret chambers. The first of these is, with the exception of Glamis perhaps, the most picturesque example of the tall-roofed and cone-topped turret style of architecture introduced from France in the days of James VI. A small space marked the armoury in an old plan of the building could in no way be accounted for, it possessing neither door, window, nor fireplace. A trap-door, however, was at length found in the floor immediately above its supposed locality, which led to its identification. At Kemnay, Aberdeenshire, the hiding-place is in the dining-room chimney, and at Elphinstone, East Lothian, in the bay of a window of the great hall, is a masked entrance to a narrow stair in the thickness of the wall, leading to a little room situated in the north-east angle of the tower. It further has an exit through a trap-door in the floor of a passage in the upper part of the building. The now ruinous castle of Towy Barclay, near Banff, has evidences of secret ways and contrivances. Adjoining the fireplace of the great hall is a small room constructed for this purpose. In the wall of the same apartment is also a recess only to be reached by a narrow stairway in the thickness of the masonry, and approached from the flooring above the hall. A similar contrivance exists between the outer and inner walls of the dining hall of Carew Castle, Pembrokeshire. Coxton Tower, near Elgin, contains a singular provision for communication from the top of the building to the basement, perfectly independent of the staircase. In the centre of each floor is a square stone, which when removed reveals an opening from the summit to the base of the tower, through which a person could be lowered. Another curious old Scottish mansion, famous for its secret chambers and passages, is Gordonstown. Here, in the pavement of a corridor in the west wing, a stone may be swung aside, beneath which is a narrow cell scooped out of one of the foundation walls. It may be followed to the adjoining angle, where it branches off into the next wall to an extent capable of holding 50 or 60 persons. Another large hiding-place is situated in one of the rooms at the back of a tall press or cupboard. The space in the wall is sufficiently large to contain 8 or 9 people, and entrance to it is effected by unloosing a spring bolt under the lower shelf, when the whole back of the press swings aside. Whether the mystery of the famous secret room at Glamis Castle, Forfarshire, has ever been solved or satisfactorily explained, beyond the many legends and stories told in connection with it, we have not been able to determine. The walls in this remarkable old mansion are in parts over 12 feet thick, and in them are several curious recesses, notably near the windows of the stone hall. The secret chamber, or Fyvie room, as it is sometimes called, is said to have a window, which nevertheless has not led to the identification of its situation. Sir Walter Scott once slept a night at Glamis, and has described the wild and straggling arrangement of the accommodation within doors. "I was conducted," he says, "to my apartment in a distant corner of the building. I must own, as I heard door after door shut after my conductor had retired, I began to consider myself too far from the living and somewhat too near the dead. In a word, I experienced sensations which, though not remarkable either for timidity or superstition, did not fail to affect me to the point of being disagreeable. We have the great novelist's authority for saying that the entrance of the secret chamber, in his time at any rate, by the law or custom of the family, could be known to 3 persons at once, viz. the Earl of Strathmore, his heir apparent, and any 3rd person whom they might take into their confidence. The great mystery of the secret chamber was imparted to the heir of Glamis, or the heir presumptive, as the case might be, upon the eve of his arriving at his majority, and thus it passed into modern times from the dim and distant feudal days. That the secret should be thus handed down through centuries without being divulged is indeed remarkable, yet so is the story, and many a time a future lord of Glamis has boasted that he would reveal everything when he should come of age. Still, however, when that time did arrive, in every case the recipient of the deadly secret has solemnly refused point blank to speak a word upon the subject. There is a secret chamber at the old Cumberland seat of the ancient family of Senhouse. To this day its position is known only by the heir at law and the family solicitor. This room at Nether Hall is said to have no window, and has hitherto baffled every attempt of those not in the secret to discover its whereabouts. Remarkable as this may seem in these prosaic days, it has been confirmed by the present representative of the family, who, in a communication to us upon the subject, writes as follows: "It may be romantic, but still it is true that the secret has survived frequent searches of visitors. There is no one alive who has been in it, that I am aware, except myself." Brandeston Hall, Suffolk, is also said to have a hiding place known only to 2 or 3 persons. End of chapter 12.